Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the Old Testament. We begin the book of Joshua today, and this is a continuation as we just finished with the fifth book of what is known as the Pentateuch, or the books of Moses, the first five books that are found in the Old Testament. Joshua is one of those books that, since it follows right on after those five books, it actually is in the chronology of things, in the events. Now, there are times when we'll read through the Old Testament and going from book to book, it's not necessarily arranged in a chronological order, but in this case, this is the chronology. It is passing, as you see in the very first verse, after the death of Moses, then raises up this person of Joshua. Now, before we look at the text, let's point out some things about Joshua, because he's a pretty interesting character. We kind of are introduced to him in chapter 17 of the book of Exodus. And so it may escape our notice, maybe out of hand, but when we really kind of take a second to think about it, this guy Joshua had been privy to some pretty important things, being at kind of Moses' right hand, and we might not really take all of that into account as we get right here to the first part of this chapter, or the first chapter, I should say. So, rewinding from Exodus 17 on, there was, at one of the times that Moses went up to the mountain to meet with the Lord, Joshua was with him. There were times when the Lord would speak directly to Moses, and Joshua would have been there to hear it as well. He would have been in the tent with Moses at the time. Joshua was one of the people who had spied out the land. And so this is a man who, I guess you could say, his whole life had been in preparation for this moment. Now, when they were going through that history, starting, let's say, at Exodus 17, neither Moses nor Joshua would have known how this would have all played out. A little bit more of it would have become kind of clear, especially after the time that the spying out of the land had taken place back in the book of Numbers. And Joshua and Caleb were told, among all the rest of the children of Israel, that they were the only ones that were older that would go into the land. And that was because they trusted God. And that was really, if you remember, that was the reason for all of their years wandering in the wilderness, was because of their unbelief when God told them to go in and take it. He was one of those two spies, again, he and Caleb, who came back and said, everything that the other spies had said is accurate. There is cause for concern here in the land, but that concern shouldn't really be something that keeps us from going and taking it, because the Lord has given it to us. So, with all of that understood, Joshua is the person who has been there at Moses' right hand. When Moses is told, you won't be going in, we studied that in the latter part of the last book. And so now as they're going in, this is the person that God has chosen, and we're going to see the direct information, the direct command, if you will, that God gives to Joshua, and that he is to lead the people in. Finally, after hundreds of years, this is going to be the realization of the promises made back as far as Abraham. Now, there are a couple of other things that I want to kind of get out of the way if I could, because really it's a book that kind of gets filled with what are the conquests of the nation as they are coming into the land. And there are some people who, as they look at this, they point out the brutality of things and how warlike this book is. And some people have a hard time trying to reconcile how is a God of love giving these directions to his people. Now, I guess the easiest way to tackle that question, and we'll have to address it a number of times as we study through the book, but it's been mentioned before, and God has been the one who has said it as we studied through the last book, as we went through Deuteronomy. We need to remember a few things. When they were doing what they were doing in the times coming up to the land of Israel, before they actually got to cross over, there were those times when God had them defend themselves, and sometimes when they were in a place of war and God had said to wipe out an entire group of people, and they are going to be asked to do the same things here. Now, there are two things that are going on. As I've mentioned before, I'll mention it again if you're new to the study through the Old Testament. When God is sending his people in, he's doing two things. it tells us God is judging these nations because of their rejection of him, because of their rampant idolatry, their cruelty, the sacrificing of their children, the horrible things that were taking place in the land, and their absolute willful pagan rebellion against God. So God is judging these nations, but it's happening at the hands of his people. So he's doing two things simultaneously. He's making good on the promise to bring his people into the land promised to Abraham hundreds of years before. At the same time, he's using his people as an instrument of judgment against those other people. Now, there are these people who would question the love of God, that how could a God of love ask people to do such a thing? And let's remember something as well, that God is just. And if the people are going to be in this place of absolute rejection of him, they're going to suffer the punishment of God, who will exact that punishment on people who absolutely reject him. It's his world to do with what he will. So that is not satisfactory to some people. They'll never be satisfied with that explanation. The only thing I can say to the people who might feel that way is to say, well, wait a minute. If God is absolutely just and has given specific instruction to people and they live in a place of absolute rebellion, then what is left for him to do? We would look at this and say, if God is absolutely just in all that he does, he doesn't in any way, he's not required to offer to man any kind of peace, because man is the one who has rebelled. But because he is a God of love and a God of justice, he's able to say, I will do these things, but I give you a way out. So in the Old Testament sense, you will find, as there are these times with Joshua, and even when we get into the Kings, where his people are put in a war footing, and yet they don't just run completely over groups of people. They move around them. They're not asked to destroy indiscriminately people. In the church, it is far more obvious that that's not the case, because God never has us as the church be a nation of people that's going to be at war with another nation of people, where that's going to be the kind of interaction that the church is going to have, because we've not been given land. And this is a case where they were given land. So let's remember that there are these covenants that are in place. God has made a covenant all the way back at chapter 12 of Genesis and reaffirmed in chapter 15 of Genesis, where he says to Abraham, I'm going to make a covenant with you as a people, and your generations, your offspring, your children will beget other children. Now we see them here finally realizing that through the tribes, the sons of Jacob. And so after generations and generations and generations, they're finally coming into that land. So God made it with the people, and so the descendants of Abraham, but he's also given it to them as a land, and they're going to go take this land. Notice he is also, because we are at this point in Joshua, he has also given them the law. So everything that God said, here's how to walk rightly before me, that has been given to them at the same time, or during that time, I should say. So let's put it all together. God made a covenant with Abraham. I'm going to make a people out of you, a nation. I'm going to give you a land. And now through Moses, he has given them a codified, in writing list of here is how you're to walk rightly and honorably before me. Now go in. Joshua is the person who is going to lead them in. That's where we are in the history of things. We're going to see the successes of Joshua. We're going to see even some of the failures and the defeat of the children of Israel as they go into the land. And so, again, this is just a study in you can have everything put before you and still rebel and still fall into the place of rebellion. So it is with them, so it is even with the church. And so that's just kind of the history of humanity. And yet God remains faithful. And even as we sit here in the year 2020, we know that God has made promises that he will make good on, and we see from time to time glimpses where God is really putting and maneuvering pieces in place to make good on all of the promises, because many of them are still future. So with that said, let's turn to the book of Joshua. We're in chapter 1. We're only going to cover chapter 1 today, mainly because chapter 2 is the conquest. It goes right into it. The conquest of the land begins at Jericho. So Jericho, of course, we all know it because the walls fell, and sometimes we just think of it more in the terms of what you might hear in children's ministry. But this is right at the front end of Joshua, is the conquest of Jericho. It's the first very big city that would be just on the other side of the Jordan. It's not far into the territory, and it's their first real engagement that we have recorded here. What we have in chapter 1 is the setup, if you will, as they're about to go in, God's command to Joshua, giving him this comfort and this peace to be ready and go. And then there is also what you have after that point. You will have then the calling of the nation together, the tribes, to ready themselves, and then Jericho comes about in chapter 2. So with that being said, let's have a word of prayer and let's look at the text. Father, we thank you as we are able to come to your word, that you instruct us and that you give us understanding and that you give us knowledge in your word. We would ask, Lord, that you would find in us people who are desiring to not only know the history, but to make the applications when application can be made. How can we walk rightly before you? What have you put before us? We thank you and we give you all praise and ask that you would instruct us through your word by your Holy Spirit, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, well, chapter 1 begins this way. Now, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, so that helps us understand where we are fitting chronologically. It is supposed to pick up right after. Now, what we get is the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, and it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, and said this: Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all the people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Now let's remember, with all that being said, it would be one thing if he was just saying, go in and take the land, I promised it to Abraham. Notice how he's making this, Joshua, I am doing this with you, knowing full well the promises that had been made, but I am now giving it to the children of Israel, the people who are with you now, Joshua. Though I made the promise hundreds of years ago to Abraham, and then reaffirming it to Jacob. And now here the tribes that are represented by the sons of Jacob, then they're the ones finally coming in. But notice how it's God who's saying, it's finally come to pass, but I'm doing this with you, and I am giving the land to those descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the sons of Jacob. You're the one who's going to lead them in. So the nice thing is that this reinstitutes the idea that I'm doing this here and now with you, Joshua. You are the man that I have called to do it. It wasn't even Moses. Moses was the one who led them out of Egypt, led them through the time in the wilderness. Good and bad, he had his mistakes, but he was really tremendously an incredible leader and an incredible intercessor. And even in his moments of weakness and failure, they were monumental, so much so that God did not allow him to lead them in. But he does allow Joshua. And so he gives direction to Joshua and makes him stand as his own man before him. It's a really impressive thing. Of course, we're going to know this by the closing chapter. He does a very amazing thing as Moses has. As he is about to depart this world, he has some very instructive things to say when we get to chapter 24. But we get here in chapter 1, verse 2, again, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you therefore, you arise, go over this Jordan, you and all the people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Now, notice what he says. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I said to Moses. Now, we're finding that in Deuteronomy chapter 11. But remember, there are a number of times when God has said, here's the boundaries of your land. And I don't care which one it is, if we understand the boundaries as they're written here in English, Israel really never took all of what God had given to them. They pretty much settled in what we would think of as Israel proper, kind of as often in the Bible you'll hear from Dan to Beersheba. That's the north to the south, and that really does kind of encompass most of the land that they took. Now, if we go from the west to the east, it would be kind of the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, but then there were the 2.5 of the tribes that took land on the other side of the Jordan. So Gad and Manasseh and Reuben had their property, and we're going to get them addressed in chapter 1. They had part of theirs in what is modern day Jordan, and that was pretty much it. So there was the north and the south of Israel. Didn't go into that sliver that goes down towards Egypt and then down towards the Red Sea. It's not really in that particular area. They didn't do a lot of dwelling in that triangular portion. They stayed in pretty much the nation proper. So with that being said, it tells us in verse 4, from the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea that is towards the going down of the sun, it will be your territory. Again, reminiscent of what we see in chapter 15 of Genesis, and really the idea of wherever your foot lands, basically, once you get on the other side of the Jordan. Now, here's the question. Some people would go ahead and say, but wait a minute. Well, what about the 2.5? When I say 2.5, Manasseh, half of the tribe of Manasseh stayed on one side of the Jordan and the other one stayed on the other in Israel. So when I talk about those ones, Gad, Reuben, and half of Manasseh, they technically did not stay in what we would consider the land of Israel. They stayed a little bit to the east, just on the other side of the Jordan River. Very good, fertile area. So with all of that being said, the territory that wherever their foot would land once they came into the land would be theirs. In addition to that was the land that God allowed them to have in what is modern day Jordan. Now here's the interesting thing. Verses 5 and 6 work so well together, and we want to make sure that we see the connection that is there. Let's read it. In verse 5 it says, now no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Now, first of all, let's deal with that phrase, not leave you nor forsake you. We think of that as a New Testament kind of a saying, and I think a few weeks back I made the mistake because I attributed it to Jesus. I went back and listened, and I attributed it to Jesus, I think. It's actually found in the book of Hebrews, chapter 13, verse 5. And it is quoting back at this. It's quoting from Joshua, but it really does help us in our understanding that this is God's nature. This is how he deals with his people. So whether it's the book of Hebrews, whether it's the book of Joshua, that idea that God would never leave nor forsake, we can think of Jesus' words when he says, anyone who comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. So that idea that no one would ever be able to come to the Lord if we come to him in a genuine sense and look to him for refuge, he's going to grant that and will never take it away from us just arbitrarily. It is one of those things. Those who seek him for refuge will find refuge in him, and it never fails. But let's look at the first part of this. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. We know that after him, there would be times when the nation, whether it's the northern tribes from Jeroboam's time on, or the southern tribes even from Rehoboam's time on, they were all going to fall at some point. What he says here to Joshua, they will have their failures. Ai will be one that we'll read about, but it would be a momentary kind of a thing. But as far as the nations, Joshua was not going to suffer defeat as the nation or the head of the nation by these other greater, more powerful nations than they. We get that again from Deuteronomy where God says, I'm going to send you in and you're going to subdue nations that are mightier than you are. And so I had mentioned Deuteronomy 11, starting around verse 23, you can see that. God tells them, there are mightier nations than you. In fact, I've made reference to it a couple of times. We have a few moments. Let's do it. Deuteronomy 11, let's look there real quick. And we can look at verse 20. Let's start at verse 22. So the book we just left, go back to the book just to your left, chapter 11, verse 22 says this, for if you carefully keep all the commandments which I command you to do, to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to hold fast to him, then the Lord, now first of all, let's just say it. Verse 22 is the qualifier. It's the if. Now, if you will do this, this is on your side, children of Israel. If you will do this, then God is saying, then I will do this. Then the Lord will drive out the nations from before you, and you will dispossess greater and mightier nations than yourselves. This is the promise made to Moses. Joshua knows this promise. It's being reaffirmed to him here in Joshua. God just leaves out the details about they're greater and mightier than you are. Doesn't matter. That's no big deal. He doesn't need to remind Joshua of that because Joshua and Caleb gave that very counsel when they were spies into the land. Sure, they're greater than we are, but who cares? God's giving it to us. That was their mentality then. God still, or Joshua still has that mentality now, so God tells him, go on in. You already have the right mindset. So he tells this to Moses, then the Lord will drive out these nations from before you. You will dispossess greater and mightier nations than yourselves. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads will be yours, from the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, to the western sea. It will be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you. The Lord your God will put the dread of you in fear upon the land where you tread, just as he had said to you. So just remember, that was being said to Moses. Joshua would know of it. It is being reaffirmed to him here. The only detail that is missing, that the nations are greater and mightier than you, he already knows that. He's known that since he first spied out the land. He had laid eyes on it. He knows this. God doesn't need to reaffirm this. But here's the important part. Think of this with all that Joshua has seen. And now once again, God reaffirms this, but he adds this little bit in. I will not leave you nor forsake you. So he has already told him, no one will be able to stand before you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. There is the foundation and why Joshua can be so firm. Though we don't hear it said necessarily like this, think of it like in this way. With that as your rallying cry and the promise from God, anytime that he would say, here's what we are going to do, even if it seems crazy to the people hearing it, Joshua would be able to say, but wait a minute, look at what God has done since the time that he led us out of Egypt. He is the one who has already said, I'm going to subdue the nations before you, and I'll do it at my pace, by the way. You're not going to do it all at once. It would be impossible. But I will give them into your hands. I will do this. You will never fail. And then he's able to say, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So if that being the case, and you know that that is the promise to begin with, is there not absolute total confidence? Would you ever fear anything? Of course, we know the answer to that. Now, let's make an application to the church before we read on. Think of similar kinds of things, though it's not national, though it's not the land or anything else, but think of the promises made to the church and who made the promises. If we think about this, God has offered to us eternity, and that eternity is going to be gathered together with him, those who have believed and trusted in the finished work of Jesus. Should there ever be any reason for fear that God will not make good on the promise? Of course not. Because the promise is, I will never cast out those who come to me. Jesus says that. Or the writer of Hebrews reminding us of what was said to Joshua, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So what that tells us is that God is immovable. He will never change. So with that as our understanding and our comfort, think about this. He is able to say then, I will never leave you nor forsake you. That is why when we go to verse 6, he is able to say, be strong and of good courage. Okay, great. Strong and courageous. The two words mean very similar kind of an understanding. So, God is telling Joshua, you're going in, Moses is dead. You're the person I'm going to use to take my people in. You're going to fulfill the promise that I made to Abraham. You're that man. You're that person. Now this is for you to go and to take place. Remember, you're going to go to people and they're greater in number. They're mightier than you are. That's not your concern. I'm giving them into your hands. Now, no, I will never leave you nor forsake you. You will not be defeated. Now be strong and courageous. That means be firm. So here again, if we understand what's being said here, if anybody was to question anything that Joshua would ever give as a directive, as the leader and as it is going to be a military campaign, he's able to stand sure-footed on this. I cannot be defeated. We cannot be defeated. We have God's promise that he will be the one who will go before us, and he will never leave us nor forsake us. So if I'm going to be strong and filled with courage, then I'm immovable. I cannot be budged from this. Now, it's reminiscent of something that Paul says. Again, let's make an application to the church, where Paul talks about, I am persuaded that neither death nor life, angels nor principalities, heights, depths, things to come. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look at that. Romans chapter 8. Let's take a look at it. This is something that the church would want to say. Now, let's be careful and make sure that we never for a moment believe that the church replaces Israel in any way. There are those who teach that. It's kind of just funny that we think about it when Paul ends at verse 37, the kind of the closeout of chapter 8. He goes right into Romans 9, 10, and 11, which talks about God's not done with the nation of Israel. So I find it very interesting, the placement of what we're about to read here. And the church should have the same kind of courage that Joshua had. It's not about going in, the conquest of a land, because the covenant made with the church isn't about land. It is about a people. It is about a covenant that was made, and it is through the person of Jesus. Even he himself would say it's a covenant that is made with them, and it is written in his blood. Whereas this covenant with the children of Israel was made verbally to Abraham, but the covenant of the law was put in writing. So here's what Paul would say in verse 37. Excuse me. In Romans chapter 8, verse 37, yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am persuaded. If a person is able to say, be strong and courageous, be immovable. You can't be budged. You're filled with courage. You're filled with strength. You cannot be moved. That's Paul. I'm persuaded. I can't be moved. I'm strong. I'm courageous. That neither death nor life, angels nor principalities, powers, nor things present nor things to come, nor height nor depth, nor any created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. We can say this. Paul was able to say, I'm firm, I'm strong, courageous, immovable. Joshua was to be the same way. His conquest was going to be one of the land. We as the church await the promise that is given to us that we will be gathered to God through the person of Jesus Christ, who gave himself as a ransom for us. So if we want to try to make some parallels and make some spiritual application, we can, but let's make sure that we don't do so at the replacement of Israel and try to put those things on the church. We're just talking about theology and the nature of God and how does he do the things that he does. So, with that being said, verse 6 tells us this. Now, be strong and of good courage, for to this people you will divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. So this is the realization, again, after hundreds of years. Think about it from the time that God gave the nation to Abraham and said, this will be the land. This is what I'm giving to you. He never asked Abraham to take it. In fact, he told Abraham that they would be displaced from the land and they would be in a place of servitude, talking about the Egyptian captivity and the slavery that would take place at the very beginning of the nation. So God never told Abraham, take the land. He never said to Isaac, take the land. He never said to Jacob, take the land. In that line of succession, or the sons of Jacob, they lived in the territory until the time that Joseph went away into Egypt, and then his brothers followed during the famine. Jacob ultimately dies in the nation of Egypt, only to be brought back into the land and buried. Same thing with his son Joseph at the end of his life. He's buried in Israel proper. That's the land of the promise. So we know that that's the case. So Jacob and then Joseph, and then here the descendants are going to come back in. Now they're coming into that land. So Joshua, you're going to be the one that God uses to bring them back in. Look at verse 7. It's said once again. Notice how often this is repeated. Only be strong and be very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. That's the qualifier. We know that Joshua was tender towards such things. That would be the key to their successes. Will you do what I've asked you to do? And will you be courageous and strong based upon those promises? And remember again, God made promises to do these things, and the qualifier was always this: if you will walk with me, do the things that I have required of you. If you will do those things, then it will go well with you. That's always been the promise. So with that being said, we get the him saying to you, read again verse 7, saying to him, be strong and of good courage, that you may observe to do all according to the law of Moses, my servant, that commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. So there is this contingency. I will go before you. You will be successful. You will never fail if you do as you're directed. So we know that Joshua did that, and even in those times of failure, Joshua would come back to the Lord. Why did we fail? Ai, again, is probably the most glaring example of this. And it is a very difficult conquest. Verse 8 says this, now the book of the law will not depart from your mouth, but you will meditate on it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For you will make your then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Really, really, again, important here. The meditation that's being spoken of here is pretty obvious that it's very active. Now, why do I say that, and why does it matter, and how do I know that? Let's go ahead and deal with meditation to begin with. There is a meditation that the world thinks of, and it's pretty mindless. When we think of the Eastern types of things, there is the altering of states, and the meditation is more the method of how do you empty yourself that you might be able to take in whatever your concept of God is. And so there are all kinds of methodologies, whether it's breathing. Think about this. Yoga has a lot to do with this kind of thing. It's a practice to empty and to come into understanding of the divine. Let's forget about that. That's the Eastern version of it. Much of the church has adopted some levels of doing exactly that same thing. All kinds of meditative practices which really kind of dull the senses, and they lead people into an experiential kind of way of thinking that they're communing with God. That is never what the scripture teaches about meditation. Because notice what happens here. He says this, but you will meditate upon what? The book of the law. Now notice this. You will meditate upon it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. So it takes an active mind to read the words that are written there, to understand them fully, and then to implement or be obedient to what is said there. You're going to need to have your mind sharp and active, and you're going to have to be fully aware of what it is that you're reading. So the meditative practices that are practiced sometimes in the church, which is pretty mindless, let alone the Eastern, which is to try to completely remove the conscious mind in the meditative practice and experience something in a subconscious level, that is never what's taught in Scripture. So in order for Joshua to do what he's being asked to do here, the meditative is the consideration of, I need to know what is written here. And it was detailed, as we've studied in the past. The book of the law was incredibly detailed. It was into the most minute of information that they had to be aware of and that they had to be obedient to. So he's told to do this at all times, day and night. And then verse 9 says, have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Third time he has said this. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Now, whenever something is said repetitious, there's a real good reason why we should say, well, why is he repeating himself? Now think about it this way. If that is said 3 times, there is this implication. There are reasons why a person may not be strong and may not be courageous. When would one of those times be? Let's think about when Joshua is ready to go in and do what he's asked to do, but he may see an army or he may see a fortification. Jericho is going to be a great example. So I can't wait to get to chapter 2, because the way that they actually ultimately subdue the city makes no sense whatsoever. When they're given the instruction to do what they're going to do, it's clear that it's God who's going to fight this battle, because they don't take it by siege. They don't take it by some kind of military might. God asks them to do a pretty bizarre thing, and then God brings the walls down for them, and then they go in and do the things that they're supposed to do. So this being strong and courageous does not necessarily always mean a military sense, but that strong and courageous sometimes means just trust me, because I'm going to do something that to you would not make sense, but that it would be obvious that it was God who did what he did, so that they would never take credit for it. But it would also get them to the point where they would realize God did this and it was obviously miraculous. We had nothing to do with it. We were just there to go in after God had done the miraculous. So with that being said, for God to remind him 3 times just in the first 9 verses, be strong and courageous. Why? Because there are going to be times when you will not be strong and courageous under other ordinary means. You're not the biggest, baddest guy on the block. Many of these nations are far greater in number and far greater in might than you are. But that's not for your concern. Be strong and courageous, because God said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So, don't you love this? Joshua, verse 10. Joshua commanded the officers and the people, saying, pass through the camp and command the people, saying, prepare your provisions for yourself, for within 3 days you will cross over the Jordan to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God is giving to you to possess. So, God tells him, be strong and courageous 3 different times. Moses says, great, get the word out, we go in 3 days. I love the assurance of this man. And again, Moses is this larger than life guy. We all have to agree with that. But Joshua has been a very impressive figure in the history of the children of Israel for these 40 years. He was there at the Exodus. He was a young man when they went and spied out. He was a man. He was over 20. Probably somewhere, Caleb was somewhere around 40 years old when this happened. But this has been a man who's been around for a long, long time, all the years with Moses, and he has seen a whole lot of things take place. So he's a very impressive figure in their history, and now he is stepping into that place of prominence. Now, he says to the Reubenites, verse 12, to the Reubenites, to the Gadites, and to half the tribe of Manasseh, Joshua spoke, saying, now remember the word which Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is giving you rest and giving you this land. Now, which land is it? Remember, as they're coming in from the east, Moses then, it's Gad and Reuben and Manasseh. People within the tribe of Manasseh said, man, we really like this area. If we think about this is like where Jericho is, right? So if we go straight across, in modern times, Jerusalem would be kind of over in this area here. So it's below the Dead Sea, it's above the Dead Sea. It's nowhere near Galilee, but the land is really, really good. They've had their problems with the Moabites. They've defeated all of them, and all the nations are done. And what Gad and Reuben and some in Manasseh say, we really like this land that's on the east of the Jordan. We want to stay here. Moses comes back at them and says, you guys just don't want to go in the land and have to deal with the conflict. So at this point, they told Moses, no, we will go in. We'll go in and we'll fight the battles with you. We'll do all of that stuff. We'll leave our livestock, our children, our wives, but our fighting men, they'll go with you. We will go in and the conquest of the land, we will be there with you, and we'll come back when it's all done. Well, now Joshua is going to put them to the test. It would give the impression that there's part of him thinking, okay, Moses is gone. Are you guys going to make good on your promise? That's why he comes to these 3 groups. To the tribes, part of Manasseh that stayed behind, that wanted to stay behind. Another part of Manasseh is going to go into the land. But Gad and Reuben, he comes to them and he says all of these things. Now remember the word which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is giving you rest and is giving you this land. Verse 14, your wives, your little ones, and your livestock, they will remain in the land which Moses gave you on this side of the Jordan. But you will pass before your brethren, armed, and your mighty men of valor, and you will help them, until the Lord has given your brethren rest. Now, we'll stop there for just a second. There's no real, we can't absolutely say exactly how long this took, but if you read the historians, and there's a couple of ways that you can try to figure this out. Probably one of the best ways is to figure out from the life of Caleb and how old he was during the time when they went in to spy out the land, how long it took for them to get into the land, and how old Caleb was. There's a way to kind of extrapolate all of those things out and get a kind of a general idea. But this would have been probably 6, maybe 7 years of the conquest that the people from Gad, from Reuben, and from half of Manasseh, they were going to leave their families behind for this conquest that took probably 6 to 7 years. So we aren't even going to see Gad and Reuben and Manasseh released from their obligatory service of the military conquest of this until the chapter 22 of Joshua. They're going to be there for almost the whole duration of this book before God gives them their release to go back to their lands. So they're going to be at war for at least 6 to 7 years before they're able to go back. So their kids, think about this, if you've left your kids, let's say that they're even in their, if they were in their adolescence, their early adolescence, by the time you come back, they're close to 20 years old. So they're going to be away for a long time, not seeing their wives and not seeing, they're going to be engaged in this. It's pretty big deal. So verse 15 says, you're going to help. Verse 14 ends by saying, your men of valor, they're going to help them until when? Until the Lord has given your brethren rest. Verse 15, and he gave you, and then also have taken possession of the land which the Lord God is giving to them. So there's going to need to be peace. For you guys to keep your land and for them to keep theirs, the conquest needs to be done. These nations need to be defeated. Then you will return to the land of your possession, and you will enjoy it, which Moses, the Lord's servant, gave you on this side of the Jordan toward the sunrise. That's towards the east. So they answered Joshua, and they said to him, all that you command us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all the things, so we will heed you. Only the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. And so their whole thing is, we made the obligation, we're going to make good on the obligation. This is a very good thing that they do. They don't try to find a way to work around it or anything else. Notice what's interesting. If you read this as a kind of a thing where there is the concern maybe that Joshua had, hey, you guys made an obligation. It is as though they say back to him, we did make an obligation and we're going to hold true to it. You hold true to your end of it, which is to walk with God as Moses did. What a cool thing. This is a neat thing when you really stop to think about the accountability of this. Joshua's holding them accountable. You made a promise to Moses. And then they would say to him, hey, there's some accountability here for you too, Joshua. You walk with the Lord as Moses did, and then we don't have any problems following you. We'll make good on our obligation. So, verse 18, whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your words. Now again, contingent on do as Moses did. We didn't rebel against him. Some did, but this is the tribes speaking as a whole. We know that during their time in the wilderness, there was all kinds of rebellion, and all the tribes had elements in it that did the same kinds of things. So here, they're speaking as one voice. You walk with God, we'll walk and we'll do as you've asked us to do, and if anybody rebels against it, there's going to be a consequence to it. Whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your words in all that you command him, he'll be put to death. Only be strong and of good courage. They are repeating back the same things that God had said 3 separate times in the first 9 verses. So once again, that tells you that it's known among the rank and file of the tribes. This idea of being firm and strong and immovable. So if the whole of the tribes, as they come into the land, if they were all going to be of this mind, and if they had continued to be of this mind throughout their entire history, nobody would have been able to stand against them during the time of the kings. If we start to think about the mighty nations who came against them from time to time, the Assyrians, whether it was them or whether it be the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, no one could have stood against the children of Israel had they walked according to God's law. Now, eventually, we know this. There would need to be a time when still Jesus would need to come into this existence and give his life on a cross, because the law, though it was given by God to them to walk accordingly, and God said, if you walk according to my law, you will never be defeated. I will fight every battle for you. The one battle that the law could never win was the battle against sin, because the sacrifices were never permanent. There would be a time when Jesus was going to have to come into this world. He was going to have to give his life on a cross, because a perfect sacrifice would need to be made. Man would never be able to, with a temporary sacrifice and their own good works, ever merit heaven. You can't get there by your own actions. It took God intervening through his Son, dying on a cross, and giving his life for the sin of mankind. It was his blood shed for the sin and the guilt of mankind. Very, very important that we understand that. So with that being said, I wanted to keep chapter 2 separate. We want to deal with Jericho, the first of their conquests, and not try to throw it in on the front end of our opening of the book of Joshua. What we get here is really the amassing of the troops and the crossing over to begin with, and then their first encounter here is at Jericho. But putting in place the understanding about God saying, look, he'll do things and make promises to people at other times, but every person still needs to recognize what God's doing with them individually, and they need to walk accordingly. So remember, it was even Moses who led the people out in the Exodus, but the promise was made to the children of Israel through Abraham. So from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and to his sons, who ended up going into that Egyptian captivity and the slavery that lasted for 400 years, only to be brought out by Moses. But Moses needed to stand before God and walk rightly before him, even though the promises were made to other people. Same thing here. Joshua, I'm using you to do what I had promised would be done, even though Moses had his successes and failures. You're the person here now. So God doesn't say, I'm going to ask you to do what I promised to Moses and you're going to go under his authority. Joshua, you stand before me. You're the person that I am using to do this. Be strong and courageous. And now he and the children of Israel are going in to make good on the promise made and to take the land, but then also to be that agent that God would use to execute judgment upon the people in the land who were rebellious, idolatrous, and wicked. So chapter 2 is where we pick up next week, and looking forward to getting into this book and spending some time in it. So with that being said, I pray that you're able to make it in next week as we get into chapter 2 and into maybe chapter 3. Lots to learn here. There's a lot of excitement in this book. It's very, very interesting to see how God will bring his people into the land. So until next week, I pray that God blesses your pursuit of him through his word.